Hey, and welcome to this lesson where we're going to be focusing now on how to actually analyze a codex. So we've got a couple of different codexes here for you. We're going to be mainly focusing on my favorite, not yours, mine. Okay, but no, we're going to be focusing on not just one specific codex. In this lesson, what we're going to be covering is actually how to analyze any codex whatsoever, because we're going to be focusing on those core things that we find in every single codex, and something that myself and Michael and the rest of the VT coaches have always used when we're giving advice when it comes to actually building a very well-balanced and sometimes thematic or even highly competitive army list. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that those three things have to be different.
No.
Because sometimes you can actually put together a really thematic, lore-based, extremely cool playstyle army that's also really good on the tabletop. For instance, the Blood Angel army that I run, or maybe my sisters, or your Death Watch, and that's really what we like to do when we're actually writing army lists for ourselves and also for others. We do really like armies to look like armies. I mean, I remember back in the day when I first started playing 40k, I think it was like 4th edition. He used to open up those beautiful pages of White Dwarf, and an army would look like an army, you know. It wasn't, oh, a bit of this and a bit of that. No, it was beautiful. So I think that's really something that we've stuck to. And I'm sure many of you at home also like that similar sort of approach to armies. So we're going to be focusing on that.
Right, but Steve, first of all, we've got to pick an army. You've got to pick an army to start with, and then you can analyse the codex. So what army are you going to pick?
Well, I'm going to go for the Blood Angels, okay? Now, when I look at the Blood Angel Codex, all right, this is actually a Codex supplement.
What does that mean?
Well, it also means I actually need the Codex. And because the Space Marines have so many rules, I need this book, which is the just regular Space Marine Codex, or the Adeptus Astartes, as they're more commonly known as. Then I also, because a Blood Angel is a type of Space Marine, I basically need 2 books.
2 books?
2 books, okay. Because I'm going to find the basic rules for the army of Space Marines in here, and then I get the more Blood Angel flavour come through in this book, all right, with some extra special stratagems in, characters and the things that only Blood Angels can take are in this one, whereas the general stuff is in here.
Right, okay.
All right?
Excellent.
Anyway, so obviously once you've picked your codex, then it's a case of, yes, we're going to talk about how you can actually write an army list for whether you're playing narratively, open play, match play, competitive play. It doesn't matter, okay, because all these principles are still the same, right?
Can I ask you a question, Steve?
Go on.
Why did you pick Blood Angels?
Why Blood Angels? Again, this comes back to a few things for me. So I love the colour scheme. That's one. You've got some incredible golds, reds, blacks. It looks cool from an army perspective because it actually challenges you as a painter because you've got different ways to paint, which is good. Again, back in when I first started playing the game, I first started off with Black Templars, and then I found Blood Angels. And I just had this, I just thought at the time, like the Assault Marine was like the coolest model ever, with this cool jump pack on, big chainsword. And then some of the games that I'd played as well, like whether it's, I think, Dawn of War, and you had these really cool jump pack guys. So there's a few really things that are very iconic also to the Blood Angels. And there is a particular aesthetic to the models as well. The Sanguinary Guard, they're absolutely jacked and shredded. And, as a bodybuilder, I've got a lot of appreciation for that kind of aesthetic, so to speak. So yeah, why not the Blood Angels? And then I've read some of the books. I've read Dante, and what an incredible story that is. So again, it really tells you a lot more about, what makes a Blood Angel and the red thirst that they have, and what a cool sort of unique thing that the Blood Angels are. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, okay, so we've talked about why you wanted Blood Angels, and you've chosen Blood Angels, and you've told me there's 2 books.
Yes.
So where should you start?
So I think really before we actually start looking at the flavour, I'm actually going to have to put that to one side because it's really important first of all actually just start to look and analyse this codex. Now the first thing that you're going to have to do is when you open up these pages, you're going to find that there's a whole different section at the start of the codex, and a lot of that is, for example, I just opened a page and it's Space Wolves, okay? So it's going to tell me a little bit narratively, a bit of what we call the lore or the backstory. So if you ever hear the word narrative or lore basically means the backstory of their army, you know, maybe their heritage, their origins, where they came from, you know, a typical fighting style and the rest of it. Okay, so then when you actually get to some of the painting pages of the Codex, looking at some of the models, you know, in the beautiful dioramas that they have, but what you're looking for is where there's a page where it says the rules. Okay, and we're going to start here, okay, because the start of the book is for you to enjoy in your own time. For us, we really want to focus on the rules. You've got, it starts with battle forged rules. So this is what happens, all the extra abilities that you get when your army is what we call battle forged, or like a legal army. Then we go into more specific army rules, okay, then we've got matched play rules. Then we've got crusade rules. Now we're not going to be touching on crusade rules in this video, okay? It might be something that we add in a later date, but for now, we're not going to be looking at crusade. I mean, it's a great, fantastic way to play with friends, but we're really going to focus on keeping it a little bit simpler. Now, match play is, if you're not familiar with that, I'll just quickly cover it. Match play is when you have a pitched battle of the same amount of points, and it's match play in which we typically play at tournaments, normally at a local gaming store for a pickup game. Whereas Crusade is a bit more of a storytelling way to evolve characters and do different things on the table, which is cool, but we're not going to focus on that. Otherwise, this lesson would be far too long. Then once we've got through Crusade, we're going to be looking at the data sheets in the book. And a data sheet is where you'll find all the rules for your particular units and characters. We've then got war gear, so what the actual weapons do, all the profiles for all the different weapons. And then we've finally got points. So how much everything costs. Because obviously when we're playing in a match play game, and typically most match play tournaments are played at the what we call strike force, and that's around that sort of 2,000 point level. What you get there is making sure that you've got 2,000 points and I've got 2,000 points, so we've both got the same, but every single weapon profile, you know, character has a points value. So a really powerful dude will be really expensive, and a really good gun will be really expensive, whereas a lesser weapon will be much cheaper, right? Makes sense. It's just to make sure we've got sort of fair and balanced games.
Excellent. So when you're looking at all of these different points, 2,000 points seems like a lot, Steve. Can we put into perspective, maybe a Space Marine? What's a Space Marine in 2,000 points? Okay,
so for example, just typical unit of Space Marines, let's take, I don't know, some intercessors. They're like the Primaris guys with a bolt gun, basically. You're looking at about 100 points for 5, so they're about 20 points each.
Okay, fantastic. But
maybe some of your more elite characters or elite models, like the Blade Guard veterans with the shields and the swords that are an elite, they're like 35 points each. So in some of the tanks could be up to maybe 200 points each, maybe ranging from 150 to 200, maybe even beyond that as well, maybe 350 points for a tank. And sometimes your characters could be at the 150 mark as well. So it all starts to add up very, very quickly, but we'll cover that later. And some of the apps that we're going to talk about later is going to really help you do that with ease.
Absolutely, and the points values do change over time, and they're updated regularly to make sure that balance is in the game.
Absolutely.
So what's the first thing we're going to look at?
Okay, so that first thing that we're going to look at is your detachment ability, all right? And this is basically what you get when you put everything in a detachment. So when I'm putting together a Blood Angel army, and I choose my detachment as we spoke about earlier, every single unit has to have the same keywords to make sure it's a legal detachment for me to then get my abilities. So for example, I need to pick the Adeptus Astartes, okay? And make sure that every single unit has first of all, the Adeptus Astartes, and then if I want a pure Blood Angel army, I need to make sure that every single unit then has where it has a bracket saying chapter, I put in Blood Angels, because that is the specific chapter I'm going to choose. So if we're doing Thousand Sons, you would have Heretic Astartes.
Absolutely.
Then you would have Thousand Sons.
Yeah.
And then if you wanted to get even more specific, you could pick a
Cabal.
A Cabal.
A Cabal, exactly, yeah.
Which is their unique way of saying chapter.
Yeah.
So what we've got, and typically we'll refer to these as your sub-chapters. So you've got your main faction and then you've got your sub-factions. Yeah. Okay, so Space Marines or Adeptus Astartes is my main one, and then Blood Angels is my sub-faction. Okay, now because I'm taking all of this, I get a few different things. I get the company command, and basically means I can only take one captain in my army, in that detachment, and I can take up to 2 lieutenants. And then I get something called chapter tactics, where I can then pick to be a Blood Angel.
Okay.
So that's what I get for having all of that in the same detachment. Okay, so that is my Battle Forged rules. Then what we go on to is looking at all the different types of chapter tactics or sub-faction benefits. So all your different cabals will have different rules. All of my different chapter tactics will all have special rules as well.
Excellent. So do you want to take us through a few of these, perhaps the Blood Angels one?
Yeah, so the Blood Angel one, again, this is where for us you're going to start to get some of the playstyle through of that army. This is going to be your first indication of how the army should play. So for example, Blood Angels get +1 to advance rolls, okay, which means you're a little bit quicker across the table. You also get +1 to wound in combat. Okay,
wow.
So I get dice modifications when I'm in combat, and I also get +1 to my charge rolls as well. So I'm a little bit easier, my charges are easier, I'm a little bit faster, and I'm better at combat, okay, because I get that +1 to wound. So all of those things have told me I'm faster, I get benefits for going into combat, and then I get even more benefits when I'm in combat. So taking a gunline Blood Angel army doesn't really, although you could do it, what we want to do at all times is what we call lean in. We want to lean into that chapter tactic, okay? We want to lean in, go all the way, follow it all the way through to the very end, because every single time we can take, and this is called a buff, every time we can take a buff and put it on a unit, we're going to maximize what we call our efficiency, so how effective we are at the table. So the more times we can do that, the better.
Absolutely, and of course this tunes into whether you want to play that army or not.
Yeah.
So you might like the lore, and then you might come to read their chapter tactic and see, oh, Blood Angels, it's very combat focused. I actually quite like the guns of Warhammer 40k,
Yeah.
So I'm going to take a different chapter because they're more focused on shooting.
Yeah, and this is sometimes a decision that you've got to make at the table. Now, if you've probably read some of the stories and you love the way that the Blood Angels fight in combat, you probably got a bit of an eye for chainswords and the rest of it. So you probably want to play in the combat phase. Whereas you might look at literally, I just love that color scheme, but I want to play it in a bit more of a gun line. And there's pros and cons to each. So combat armies are a bit more finesse, because obviously you actually have to get to combat to be able to do the thing you want to do while your opponent's shooting at you. Whereas if you're a more shooting army, as long as what we call your target priority is good, where you understand what you need to kill when, you can use the range of your weapons to destroy your opponent. So sometimes can be a little bit easier to start off with by picking a gunline based army, but the huge potential of combat is massive. The damage you can do there is probably surpasses some of the damage you can do in combat. So yeah, I mean, each of these different ones are a little bit, different. You've got White Scars there, it's called Lightning Assault, so they can, get across the table really quickly with some of their rules. Ultramarines called Codex Discipline, they're able to fall back and shoot, which is really cool. So again, different strokes for different folks.
Yeah,
all right,
absolutely.
But always lean into that. So once we're beyond looking at our chapter tactics, and we're still in this sort of battle forged role, then what we've got is different abilities in the Codex. So for example, you can sometimes upgrade models, you can buff them up a little bit better. Again, you can start to pick these, what we call they're called chapter command in my book, but they might be different in yours. But basically you can start to pay points for better abilities on these characters or units or models. And again, you want to pick the ones that really lean into that play style. So there might be something that helps me get re-rolls, and that will help me navigate some of my weapon minuses, for example, that the Blood Angels typically take. And these are all things that we need to constantly think about and analyze when we start to look at our strengths, weaknesses, threats and opportunities at the very end of this, where we start to critically analyze what our army list really looks like.
Excellent stuff. So we've looked at sort of your chapter tactics, and we know that if you take a whole detachment of Space Marines, you get your chapter tactic. There's limitations on the detachment, as we discussed in the detachments lesson. Space Marines get their own sort of special ability just for being Space Marines, don't they?
They do, yeah. So once you've got your specific chapter tactic, you also get your benefits for being that faction as well. Typically, and with each book it sometimes varies, so there's no hard and fast rule for exactly what you get, but what you'll notice when you start to look at some of the data sheets is it will say little keywords, for example, and then like in the Space Marine one, it's called Angels of Death. You then find the Angels of Death section in here, and it will tell you what you get for just being a Space Marine, or what you get for being a Adeptus Sororitas, for example.
Okay.
So, Sisters of Battle. So that's your sort of basic, and then you get a little bit more extra benefits for being pure Blood Angels. And then sometimes you can get another benefit as well if you really keep that army even purer and just wholesome of one army rather than mixing and matching. And they're called all different types of names. In the Space Marines, they're called Doctrines, where you get benefits to some of your weapons at certain stages of the game. And then certain armies, like the Blood Angels, in the Assault Doctrine, which is exactly what they want to be when they start getting benefits to their melee weapons, they get another benefit again as well. So you've got to think of these different like layers and levels. So you get your army-wide rule for being a Space Marine, which is basically one attack if you charge, were charged, or are charged, or heroically intervene. You then get, for example, your chapter tactics. So I'm a Blood Angel, I get +1 to wound in combat, +1 advance and charge. And then I get these, because I'm a pure Blood Angel army, I get my Doctrines. So I go through the heavy support one, or for heavy weapons, I then go for the sort of rapid fire and assault weapons. And then when I get to turn 3 and onwards, the Assault Doctrine, I get extra AP to my melee weapons, which is brilliant. But then because I'm there, I also get my pure Blood Angel one. So it's just these different layers and layers and layers, which we want to constantly lean into. Absolutely,
that's fantastic. If I wanted to take maybe Sisters of Battle and run them with my Blood Angels, what would I be sacrificing? How would I build an army around that?
So you have to keep in your detachments Blood Angels. So you have to have a detachment of Blood Angels, and you have to have a detachment of Adeptus Sororitas. You can't have like a Canoness from the Adeptus Sororitas leading Blood Angels. You can't have that in that detachment. So you still have to have your different detachments for those. So let's say we're doing a doubles game and you wanted, I don't know, some sort of Adeptus Sororitas, I wanted the Blood Angels, you would take a detachment, maybe a patrol, I would take a patrol. But what we would lose, because our entire army is not a pure Blood Angel army or a pure Adeptus Sororitas, I would lose that special ability where we start getting Doctrines. And I would then get because I'm losing my Doctrines, I wouldn't get my Blood Angel specific one as well. Same for you with the Adeptus Sororitas, it would tell you in your book what you get when you start to break those detachments as well. Okay. So it will change depending on those. And sometimes allies don't even work, like the Thousand Sons would never work with obviously the Blood Angels, because they do not share that same keyword, which is Imperium, which is again on the data sheets of your models. It will say Imperium, then it will say Adeptus Astartes or Adeptus Sororitas, depending on which faction, and then it will say your chapter.
So taking a faction and sticking to just that faction in your army seems to give you a bit more power for those units.
Yeah, exactly, because all those benefits are going to buff all of the other models in your army.
Excellent.
Okay, so it does, add a little bit more value there, and again helps you really lean into that play style of that army. All right. So the next thing that we get is stratagems. Now, stratagems are where you can spend your resources, called command points, and some of these are very specific for certain units, and also sometimes special characters, or they can be played in certain phases and not in others. And it also tells you what the stratagem's name is, the little bit of lore behind it, but most importantly what the rule is, how it interacts, and it will give you a cost of that. So if it costs you 2 CPs and you've only got 1 CP left of resources, we can't use it because you don't have enough. Whereas if you've got maybe 4 and it only costs you 1, well, once you've used it, you're only going to have 3 left. And the thing to note about stratagems as well is you can only use a stratagem typically, unless stated otherwise, once per phase.
Absolutely. So you could use any number of different stratagems, provided you had the command points, but only a specific stratagem once per phase. Yeah.
So as soon as you're into the next phase, you could use it again if you so wanted to.
Absolutely.
Now, again, what you want to be doing is when you're analysing your codex and you've picked your chapter tactic, I'm looking for things here in the stratagem pages that help me in combat. I'm thinking of, is there any units that they buff in combat? So I'm going to look through this and I'm thinking, right, great. There might be one that allows you to fight in death for my characters. Well, cool. Well, I'm really good at fighting in combat, and if I can do that when I die, even better. I'm going to get more value. I'm really leaning into that. Maybe there's something on a certain hit roll of a 6, like auto wound. Great, that helps me in combat. Or maybe extra attacks when I'm in combat, or advance in charge. Again, that's all these extra benefits I'm constantly thinking about. And what you want to be doing at this stage is, maybe getting some post-it notes, or in, like putting a post-it note with a big circle on, some of the command points that you really like the sound of, maybe starting writing them down. And sometimes it will say certain keywords, so you want to write down what those keywords are. Maybe it's character, maybe it's a different type of unit profile that it only works on. And again, keywords are really important, so when we start to get to the data sheets, you can start to analyze actually what these stratagems are going to work on, all right?
That sounds fantastic. So what we're saying here is if you look at the keywords, you'll be able to see that maybe some data sheets are able to make full use of these stratagems, and other data sheets might not.
Exactly. So again, we want to keep leaning into that approach, so after we've got stratagems, we then start to look at warlord traits. Now, warlord traits are something that you can put on character models, okay? And normally, you can, sometimes you might take one, sometimes you can take more if you've got stratagems that allow you to take more. But these warlord traits, again, they'll be put onto your main characters, because what you'll do is have to dedicate one of your characters to be a warlord of your army. And that's something when we look at army construction, you always need is a warlord. And that will sometimes trigger other benefits or also mission-specific parameters. So one guy or girl is going to be a warlord. They will be a character. And then you can sometimes put warlord traits either on them or other characters as well of that nature. And again, when you're reading through these warlord traits, typically some will just buff the character itself, maybe give it extra damage or survivability, but other times what it will do is actually what we call buff other models around them, okay? And what you'll see is that it's called aura. So if it says aura, it means that anybody within a certain range, so you imagine where that character is right in the middle, we create a distance around it of 6 inches. Anything that gets touched of your units are going to be affected, probably in a positive way. If they've got a debuff, that will debuff your enemy units, but again, sometimes you have to get there, or sometimes you have to pick a unit. So again, you want to be thinking, what are those things that I can lean into my army's capabilities? And it's in the warlord traits and the relics of the army that sometimes what you want to do is actually pick at the end once you've written your army list. Because personally, I like to pick warlord traits in relics that help me look at some of the weaknesses of my army or the threats of my army, and I want to put them in there to try and maybe like circumnavigate some of those weaknesses of the army. So let's say I analyze my codex at the end, or my army list at the end, and I think, well, actually charging is really important. Like making my charges is really important, because being stood out in the open is not a good thing for me. Maybe if I've got a relic that helps me get there quicker, or maybe a warlord trait that allows me to re-roll my charges. Again, really powerful stuff for my army, because it helps me circumnavigate a weakness, which is I've put as failed charge is a weakness. So again, warlord traits and relics can be a way to circumnavigate, or sometimes some of your stratagems as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So at this stage, we're probably looking at putting post-it notes down and saying, well, okay, these stratagems help me lean into, let's say, Blood Angels charging combat. And then we look at the warlord traits and we say, okay, well, some of these lean into, combat and charging. And then, of course, the relics, combat and charging. So you want to kind of associate all of these, link them together to like a common goal that your army is focused on.
Yeah, or maybe, actually, I'm really weak here and I can need a little bit more survivability, so maybe there's some things you can draw on from the relics or whatever it might be. Okay, so we've covered all of that, and now it's next time to look at actually looking through the data sheets. And the first data sheets that you're going to start to get to are things called characters. Now, characters are, again, these are the leaders, the HQs of your army, and these will have very specific abilities, and they're often called command abilities. So you can have command abilities and auras. We've already spoke about how auras work, but command abilities typically happen in the command phase, where what you'll do at the start of your turn, when the command phase begins, you'll pick a model or a unit within a certain range of you, and you'll say, right, that unit of Blood Angel Assault Marines are going to have this special ability, and that lasts normally until the the start of my next command phase. So I've buffed them up, they can go off and do whatever they want. They don't need to stay near the character, whereas the auras kind of do have to stay near that character. It's on them until the end of the next command phase of yours, or start of your next command phase. Whereas the auras, you're only benefited by it whilst you're within that aura. So again, start to look at those command abilities, see which ones really affect your army, and really lean into that. And probably something we should otherwise mention at this stage as well, some of these characters sometimes psychers, and they'll have a psychic tree. Like your army has plenty of psychers in it, the Thousand Suns over there, so they'll have a very specific, what we call psychic tree that you can pick from. Sometimes they've got things like chaplains, which got something called litanies. I've got specific litanies for my army. That's very different to how, let's say, Adeptus Sororitas work with some of their abilities. And again, you'll see what they are, but on the data sheets, it will tell you either how many powers they can pick, what they can do, whether they can know one power or multiple powers. And again, some of the more powerful characters will know more and be able to do more for you on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the psychic powers, it's sort of, you look at them in maybe the same way as your Warlord Traits and your relics and your stratagems. You know, there's going to be buffing powers, debuffing powers, and you really want to post-it note them as well, categorize them and how they're going to help you. Blood Angels have access to their own psychic tree as well, and I'm sure there's plenty in there that really help combat and charging.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, once we've looked at that, we looked at the HQs, we know what those command abilities are. Again, start to rethink about, okay, this sounds cool. Then look at the units, okay? And then when you look through the units, whether they're troops, whether they're elites, fast attack, and everything else from those different detachments, start to think about some of those units in terms of some of the damage that they can do. Okay, so some are, you know, if they've got lots of attacks, they're probably going to be good in combat. If they've got really good ballistic skill or really good weapon profiles that they can shoot at range or lots of shots, they might be more of a gunline based option. And I think that's where the skill really comes in looking at those data sheets, understanding, is it more shooty, is it more combat? If I had to give it a number from 1 to 5, where would it be? Or is it, flat bang in the middle? It does a little bit of both, okay? So again, we're looking for, if it's more of a melee based unit, it will actually have a melee weapon. If it doesn't have a melee weapon, it will just have to fight with its fists, which isn't particularly great. And sometimes if it doesn't have a ranged attack, whether it's a rapid fire, pistol, assault, or a heavy weapon, then it's probably not going to be very good at shooting either. All right. So again, lean into that. Lean into those units that you think are going to be really fit well with your army. So I'm going to be looking for most units with a good melee weapon. Thunder hammers, power swords, lightning claws, chainswords, all that kind of stuff. Great. Perfect to go into my army. And really start to build a list with that. So I think that pretty much concludes most of analysing the Codex. As we mentioned earlier, everything will have a point value, but we're not quite at that stage yet. We're just trying to, at this stage, bring things together, make a bit of a draft of a list, and in our next video, we're going to start to looking at how you actually start putting these units together in an app, or maybe even on a spreadsheet, just to start formulating the points, and then we can start doing some reflection, critical analysis, and then start to drawing up that SWOT analysis.
Absolutely. So grab your Codex, look at your stratagems, your Warlord Traits, your relics, look at each of your units, maybe mark down, oh, is it fast, is it tough, does it shoot, does it do combat, and then come join us for the next lesson.
Absolutely.